everyone, welcome to episode 3 of season 5. It's a beautiful morning here in Belfast. Spring is in the air, and I'm sure you had a very pleasant drive through the countryside this morning, Jim.
Well, to be honest, Ollie, I spent the journey calculating how much diesel I was using because obviously with the enormous inflation of diesel, I think I invested the GDP of Portugal filling my petrol tank some months ago. So I completely ignored the weather outside.
Oh man, that's related. Yeah, I went on a drive the other day and it was an absolute fortune to fill the tank. It's crazy how expensive it's got. But this morning, Jim, we're turning to a fascinating topic and one that'll be highly significant for Christians in the coming years. Earlier today, you forwarded me an email about a new set of laws that the Northern Ireland Department of Justice intends to introduce, and the legislation is called the Hate Crimes Bill. And it's possible that this new legislation will actually make it illegal for parents to object to their children being taught LGBT ideology in their schools. And parents who do object could be charged with a hate crime. In Westminster, the UK government is still consulting on the so-called conversion therapy ban, and lobbyists for the LGBT movement are attempting to use the new laws to outlaw the teaching of orthodox Christian morality in our church pulpits. It's taken a huge amount of effort by Christians in the UK to maintain our historic right to call everyone to repentance. Across the Atlantic, in the United States, the governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis, has introduced a piece of legislation to ban the teaching of gender ideology to kindergarten children. And the progressive left has reacted very angrily to this. They've labeled the Florida bill as the Don't Say Gay bill. And in a recent opinion poll, 35% of Americans think that kindergarten children should be taught about transgenderism and sexualized identities. And those 3 examples, Jim, demonstrate why our topic of conversation today is so important. As we talk about law in this episode, we're going to ask, how have we got to the point where law is being used as an incredibly effective weapon against Christians in our society?
Well, I will be relying on your expertise here, Ollie, because you studied law at university. And one of the oldest essay questions that law students have to answer relates to the question of natural law. Is there such a thing as natural law, or is law a purely human and cultural artifact? Now, that question probably causes sane non-lawyers to lose the will to live. So it probably caused you to lose the will to live as well.
It really did.
So I want to start with a really simple, easy-to-understand illustration. I'm sure you have all looked at a map of the world and looked at the borders between countries. And at first sight, most borders look to, meander all over the place. There seem to be no straight lines at all. But there is a sense to those complicated boundaries, with their twisting turns and meandering lines. To make sense of them, look at the map that shows the underlying geographical features of the world. And suddenly you see that the borders between countries tend to follow things like major rivers or mountain ranges. It's an historical fact that the most successful borders between countries are the ones that follow the geographical boundaries of the natural world.
Yeah, and there are some countries in the Middle East, for example, whose borders are long, straight lines. So countries like Iraq and Yemen and Syria, they have borders that are effectively lines in the sand.
Yes, those borders were drawn as part of a power struggle between Britain and France in the Middle East. I think they formed part of what was called the Sykes-Picot Agreement. And the interesting thing about those borders is that they were a disaster. As we all know, they led to a century of bloodshed and social upheaval in the Middle East. So those bad examples of borders actually strengthen my case, that good borders between countries tend to follow the underlying boundaries provided by nature itself. Now, let's apply that analogy to the question of law. Laws, like borders, are man-made things. They are a human construct. But good laws aren't just lines in the sand. They follow what is called natural law. And by natural law, we mean the underlying moral boundaries on which this universe is built. Christians say that in Genesis 1, God establishes boundaries in nature. He separates the sky and the land and the sea, for example. He creates natural boundaries. But the Bible also teaches that God has established moral boundaries. Some basic, deep principles that describe how human society should operate. And so, the argument goes, good human laws are those that follow the moral landscape that God has built for us.
Yeah, I think that's a really helpful idea, Jim. And a good example of natural law is the institution of marriage. It's clear from Genesis that God establishes the biological family with a husband and wife who become father and mother to their children as a basic building block of society. And when we come to the book of Exodus and come to Mount Sinai, where God establishes his law, the boundaries around the family unit are once again drawn out. That's why there are commandments not to commit adultery and to honor one's father and mother.
You can actually take that example a bit further, Ollie. I mean, think of the so-called Equal Marriage Act of 2014. That piece of legislation ignored the underlying moral boundaries that should underpin a society. Instead of following natural law, if you like, the UK Parliament drew a line in the sand. They invented a new construct by redefining marriage to be a relationship between two people of either gender. But the problem with lines in the sand is that they are completely arbitrary boundaries, and so soon they start to shift. Why restrict marriage to just two people? So-called polyamorous relationships involve 3 or more consenting adults who claim to be in love. So why are they excluded from the institution of marriage? If consent is the only principle at stake, then inevitably the line in the sand will shift, and soon the whole concept of marriage will disappear from society, which of course was the game plan all along. An even more emotive example is the introduction of legal abortion into society. Once again, once a society moves away from natural law, from the underlying moral boundaries that underpin a society, then the lines in the sand start to move at incredible speed. So according to natural law, there are some deep principles that are as immovable as the Alps or the Himalayas. For example, all human life is sacred. Personhood is a gift from God. It's not related to our functionality. But in 1967, as a society, we stepped away from those natural boundaries and drew our own line in the sand. At first, abortion was only offered in the most extreme situations, in the cases of incest or rape or when a mother's life was in danger. But with bewildering speed, the West has moved to the point where abortion on demand is now regarded as a basic human right.
The technical term for what we've been calling the line in the sand approach to law is a thing called legal positivism. According to legal positivists, there is no relationship between law and morality, between law and justice. Laws are just commands from a sovereign power. Provided a piece of legislation has been constructed by a properly run set of institutions, social institutions, then it is law. Laws are just social facts and nothing more than that. And legal positivism is actually a fairly modern idea. The idea of natural law is a much older concept. It comes from the Greeks and also from the Old Testament. Given that this season is all about origins, I want us to think about the origin of law. So we'll look at 3 origin stories for law: the Greek origin story, the biblical origin story, and the origin of modern legal positivism.
Okay, I'm smiling, Ollie, because for the next few minutes we are going to walk around a world of weirdness. But anyway, weird stuff is interesting. Over the Christmas period, I became so bored that I decided to read a play written 2,500 years ago by a Greek playwright called Aeschylus. And it's actually a trilogy of plays called the Oresteia.
I don't know why I've never thought about doing that. When I'm bored, I tend to watch TV or go out for coffee, but actually I'll add that to my list.
Well, I should quickly say, I know as much about Greek tragedies as I know about the back of the moon, but my sister Helen happens to be an expert in all this stuff. So with her help, I fought my way through all 3 plays. Now, be prepared, dear listener, for a strange and grotesque tale.
That's surely the way any good story begins.
So the first play is called Agamemnon. Agamemnon is the name of the king in the story. And he comes from a dynasty that seems to have been cursed by this cycle of revenge. You know, one terrible deed is avenged by an even more terrible deed. It's revolting stuff. And 10 years earlier, Agamemnon had set sail to conquer Troy, as you do. But the journey runs into trouble, and he is told to sacrifice his daughter Iphigenia to appease the goddess Artemis. And Agamemnon obeys. He sacrifices his daughter, and his fleet is saved. And now, 10 years later, Agamemnon returns to his homeland after winning a triumphant victory over the Trojans. And this first play is dominated by Agamemnon's wife, who is called Clytemnestra. And she is full of moral rage towards her husband because, obviously, he has killed her daughter, Iphigenia. And Clytemnestra, along with her lover, concoct a scheme to kill Agamemnon as an act of revenge. And the scheme is successful, and Agamemnon dies. Clytemnestra is relieved that the deed is done and hopes that her house can now rest in peace. Okay, so that's the first play. Now, in the second one, it's called The Libation Bearers, the cycle of revenge takes yet another turn. Clytemnestra has a son called Orestes, and he is instructed by the god Apollo to kill his mother as an act of justice, because, of course, she has murdered his father. Are you with me so far, Ollie, here?
I'm clinging on, Jim, but to be honest, I'm in awe of your ability to pronounce these names. It's actually remarkable. I'm really impressed.
Well, and things are going to get even worse here, because Orestes does indeed kill his mother, but he's then hounded by these three terrifying beings called the Furies. Three of them, all female. They're Gorgon-like creatures with black snakes intertwined in their hair and blood and pus dripping from their eyes. I mean, nice girls, really, just in need of a good strong shampoo. Now, you shouldn't think of the Furies as evil. They're really not evil. In fact, they're actually very moral. They represent what you might call the primordial desire for justice, the cry for justice. You know, when blood has been spilled, they shriek for vengeance. And in this second play, a big argument develops between the god Apollo, who believes that Orestes' action is a just one, and the Furies, who treat him like a simple murderer. And in the end, the Furies drive Orestes mad. And the final play is called The Eumenides, and it takes place in Athens. And it is really a trial scene, okay, where Orestes will be prosecuted for murdering his mother. And the judge is the goddess Athena. And Orestes is prosecuted by the Furies, who scream for blood, and he's defended by Apollo, who represents what we might call the light of civilization and justice. Now, thank you for sticking with me through that, Ollie. But I hope you can begin to see why this trilogy is so important and so venerated in history. It raises all sorts of profound questions about justice. Now, here's the thing. The ending is really curious. I'm not sure I fully understand it. Because Athena, who is the judge, eventually acquits Orestes because she says that Clytemnestra's murder of her husband was worse, because Agamemnon was the king. Now, that logic is very revealing. The message is that the main point of justice is to maintain social order. In fact, that is perhaps Aeschylus' main point, that justice is about order. It acts as a defense against chaos. And the most interesting feature of Athena's judgment is that she invites these three Furies into the Athenian system of justice. They are given a place of honour and are now called the Eumenides, which means kindly ones, and that must rate as the greatest rebranding exercise in all of history. But you get this sense of pragmatism that we found actually in Athena's earlier judgments. Violent revenge, represented by the Furies, is being domesticated. And that's actually a pretty cynical view of law and justice. Its purpose is to discipline violence in society, to stop the endless cycle of bloodletting. Anyway, I've been a bit self-indulgent there. That's enough Greek tragedy for today. But the big idea in this Greek origin story is that justice is actually a pragmatic thing. Its aim is to stabilize society, to maintain balance, to protect it from chaos, and to domesticate the wild, raw lust for revenge. Justice is about being civilized.
The second origin story we want to think about is very different from the Greek one. It's the story told in the second book of the Bible, in the book of Exodus. And I just want to read a few verses from chapter 19 of that book, which describe the dramatic scene at Mount Sinai where God gives his people the law. On the morning of the third day, there was thunder and lightning, with a thick cloud over the mountain, and a very loud trumpet blast. Everyone in the camp trembled. Then Moses led the people out of the camp to meet with God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. Mount Sinai was covered with smoke, because the Lord descended on it in fire. The smoke billowed up from it like the smoke from a furnace, and the whole mountain trembled violently. As the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses spoke, and the voice of God answered him. The Lord descended to the top of Mount Sinai and called Moses to the top of the mountain.
I mean, so many of us were taught that story in Sunday school that we can lose its impact. And that amazingly dramatic story teaches three really deep lessons about justice. And I want to think about justice first before we turn to the question of law, okay? And the most obvious point to make about this origin story is that justice descends from heaven. God himself descends to the top of Mount Sinai. We know from the New Testament that he brought countless thousands of angels with him, and they would be responsible for the implementation of justice on earth. But the sheer drama of heaven descending to human beings who are quaking in their boots teach us that in biblical thought, justice descends from heaven. Justice isn't a human invention. It isn't the result of some civilizing process. We begin the story by bowing under the authority of divine justice. Now, that simple idea explains a big difference between Western culture, which has inherited that idea, and something like Chinese culture, which is not. In the West, we talk about the rule of law. In places like China, they talk about rule by law. So Westerners have until recently seen law, I'm talking about natural law, as a transcendent thing. It rules over all of us, whether we be king or a pauper. The law rules us. We obey the rule of law. But in places like China, law is an instrument of power for the elite. Rulers rule by law. They see law as little more than commands, as instruments of control and power. And it seems to me that that huge difference in approach can all be traced back to the verses you just read from Exodus 19. Justice descends from heaven.
And when we were talking about the Greek origin story of justice, you mentioned those strange figures called the Furies. You said they represented the cry for justice. When blood has been spilled, they shriek for vengeance. Isn't that idea missing from the Exodus story?
Yeah, towards the end of his life, Moses composed a song. We call it the Song of Moses. And he says of the Lord in that song, "Vengeance is mine. It is mine to repay, saith the Lord." In the Greek story, there's a really obvious tension between the enlightened, sophisticated Apollo and this primordial, ugly lust for vengeance embodied by the Furies. And that incoherence is never resolved by Aeschylus. You end up with a political fudge. Now, contrast those pus-filled Furies with the angels in Revelation who pour out the bowls of God's wrath on a rebellious earth. Scripture says they are dressed in pure white linen with gold sashes. The point being made is that in Christian thought, God's wrath is morally beautiful. God's wrath is his implacable hostility to evil, his refusal ever to compromise with it or to sweep it under the carpet. Remember, there is no incoherence in God's character. He offers us salvation as a free gift. He longs to forgive us, but for those who refuse that offer, there will be a final judgment. I mean, think of those heartrending cries of mothers in Ukraine as they howl in anguish over the body of a dead child. Oh, God hears those cries. He stores every tear in a bottle. And one day, those responsible will be judged. Those mothers can trust in God's justice, so they need not seek their own vengeance. And in the end, we will rejoice in God's justice.
It's interesting that in our society, we often focus exclusively on God's love. But throughout most of history, the cry from the human heart has been for justice. And your point is that God's justice is both coherent and beautiful.
That's right. So, two things. God's justice descends from heaven. And secondly, it is coherent and beautiful. The final observation I would make is that God's justice operates within a covenant. Now, that might seem like an arid technical point, but it is revolutionary. Societies don't civilize themselves through some form of social Darwinism. We don't pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. A well-ordered society isn't a human invention. It's an instantiation of God's design plan for humanity. So, here's my point. Society works when it adopts the right posture towards God.
In Exodus, we find lots of specific laws. We have laws about family life and work life and how to treat other people. But all those laws are part of an overall relationship agreement between the people and God. They are situated within a covenant.
Yeah, that's my point. The covenant acts as a sort of meta-law, if you like. So the individual laws address individuals in the community. But sitting above those laws is this agreement, an agreement between God and society. It's as if God says to a society, now look, if you obey the specific laws, then things will go well for you. But if you as a group rebel against the laws, then your society will implode. It's not that God's being vindictive or anything like that. He's simply pointing out the consequences of crossing natural boundaries in a moral universe.
So far in this discussion of the Bible's origin story, we have talked a lot about justice, but not very much about law. What are we to make of the Old Testament laws then, Jim?
Well, not everyone listening will necessarily agree with what I'm about to say, but I see quite a distinction between what we call the Ten Commandments and the rest of the Old Testament law. Now, please don't think I'm saying that the Old Testament law is somehow less important or less relevant. That's most certainly not what I'm saying. I'm suggesting that the Ten Commandments, or the 10 words as we really should call them, act a bit like a fountainhead from which all the other laws flow. We talked earlier about Genesis 1, when God established all the boundaries for the natural world. He separated the sea from the land and so on. And in that account, God speaks 10 times. And we find God here giving 10 direct words at Mount Sinai. The other laws are mediated through Moses, but the 10 words come directly from God. And I wonder if those 10 words are like the rivers, the mountain ranges, and the oceans of the natural world. Perhaps they represent what we might call natural law, the basic moral boundaries on which this universe is built. So, think about them. They define our posture towards God, towards family and work life, our relationship to truth and false ideas and idolatries, our relationship to material goods. They define the value of human life. So I find it helpful to see the 10 words as the fountainhead of law in any society.
When a young Christian reads through the Old Testament laws that we find, say, in the book of Exodus or Leviticus, they can seem very strange. How should we understand them?
Okay, well, I would say 2 things about the Old Testament laws. The first is that they were never designed to be comprehensive. You know better than I do, Ollie, that modern law is vast in its scope. EU law on farm produce runs to 32,000 words, for example. But all the laws in our own country would fill a vast library. No one could ever hope to know them all. But Old Testament law was never designed to be comprehensive because its main function was to educate. That's why parents were told to teach the law to their children. Sometimes they attached little boxes filled with the law, writings of the law, to their foreheads, as a symbol of the law being at the forefront of their minds. So the laws of the Old Testament can best be understood as examples, as case studies that taught people the underlying principle called wisdom. By moving from the particular to the general, they were learning about God's sense of justice. They were learning principles about how to build good neighbourly relationships, about how to forge a just and fair society. So when someone learned those laws in Exodus 20 about, how to deal with a bull that gores someone, they were really learning about the principle that we today call criminal negligence.
That's a helpful way to think about it, Jim, but many young Christians are still left with the feeling that the Old Testament laws are culturally remote.
Well, of course they are. The Old Testament laws are a response to a specific culture that existed in the late Bronze Age. So, in the ancient Near East, war and famine and slavery were woven into the fabric of human existence. So was patriarchy. Now, of course, the Bible doesn't condone any of those things, but they were realities that had to be addressed. And so many of the laws are designed to protect, female prisoners of war, for example, or to protect the poor from the abuse of power. And the point is that we can use those specific laws as case studies that reveal a great deal about God's heart and his wisdom. And then we can apply the principles we learn to the vulnerable in our own society and build laws like those early ones that protect them.
A liberal critic might argue that we could take the Old Testament laws related to sexuality and apply them in a different way to our own cultural setting.
Well, recall our earlier conversation about the 10 Commandments acting as the fountainhead of law. It's really interesting that those laws in Leviticus about sexuality, those laws which prohibit illicit forms of sexual activity, they are all couched in the context of family. Anything which attacks the concept of the family unit is forbidden. And that is the universal standard for all cultures.
So we've thought about 2 origin stories so far. The story told by the Greek playwright called Aeschylus, and the origin of the law described in the book of Exodus. But a much more recent approach to law has become popular in recent years, an approach I was taught at university. And it's a thing called legal positivism. And according to that doctrine, there is no necessary relationship between justice and law at all. We should see laws as rules, commands, created by a properly functioning set of social institutions.
And that brings us back to the example laws that you mentioned in your introduction, things like the ban on conversion therapy and so on. I mean, legal positivism is a really dangerous idea, I think, because it effectively reduces law to an instrument of social power. Laws just become commands that enforce social conformity and which discipline violence. Now, I have been accused of many things, but never of being a lawyer. But it seems to me that no one really believes in legal positivism. I think this is its fatal flaw. It's just one of those ideas that never works in practice, because every law that is introduced is sold to us as a just law. There is a moral force behind it. I mean, think of the arguments over mask wearing or vaccinations during the pandemic. No one said, this is just a command. The new regulations were explained in moral terms. They were underpinned by a sense of justice. But here is the big problem. Whose justice are we talking about? Once we cut ourselves off from natural law, once we start drawing lines in the sand, once we start to ignore the moral boundaries that have been encoded into reality, then societies start to use law to enforce their own false moralities, their own idolatrous views of justice. And I think that is exactly what is happening to our society. We take the term social justice. It's a term we hear bandied about a lot these days. But really, social justice is a system of morality that venerates autonomy, expressive individualism, and critical theory. The progressive left has created its own understanding of justice, not the justice that descended from heaven, at Sinai. And they're using law as an instrument of power to enforce conformity.
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant critique of legal positivism, Jim. We actually see that misuse of law quite often in the book of Daniel, where law is used to drive social engineering and to get rid of non-conformists.
Yes, that's a really good example. It's not just Daniel 3 with the threat of the fiery furnace. The sadder case comes in chapter 6 with the story of Daniel and the den of lions. Because the king in that story, Darius, had been tricked into passing a law by a group of lobbyists who hated Daniel and all that he stood for. And much as Darius had sympathy for Daniel, he was trapped by his own legal system. And so he had to allow Daniel to be thrown into the den of lions. Now, fortunately, the lions did not rebel against their creator, and Daniel was saved. But that story shows that good-hearted people can be fooled by lobbyists and activists who hate the true justice of God. And by the time those good-hearted people realize that they've been fooled, it's too late, because the law will have been put in place. Now, that ancient story offers two positive and useful lessons. It teaches us to show courage, and it teaches us to pray. We live in a society where the law is being used by cunning people who hate the God of the Bible and who are determined to shut out his voice from society. And so our job is to show courage and to pray.
Thanks, Jim, and thank you all for listening. Next week, we're going to consider another origin story, the origin of cities. And we've also decided at the end of this series to add a bonus episode considering the origins of war. So please do stick around for that. In the meantime, please continue to rate and review the podcast on whatever platform you listen, and please share individual episodes with friends and family. We'd love as many people as possible to engage with this content, and we need your help to make that happen. We'll see you all again next week.